Greater Glories by C.L. Moore. Originally published in the September 1935 issue of Astounding Stories magazine. Republished in a collection of the author's stories entitled Miracle in Three Dimensions and Other Stories in 2008. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel Quasar Spectra. Greater Glories. Sunlight beating upon his closed eyelids roused him out of that cloudland which borders on the edge of nothingness. He opened his eyes wearily to a hot expanse of blue, and after a while dragged himself clear of the water and up a little along the sand. He slept. When he woke, the sun had moved on, leaving him in shadow, and he felt refreshed and rested, though very weak. He sat up and took stock of his surroundings. Blue sky and blue sea, and the dazzle of sun on empty water. Out beyond the reef he could see the hulk of the splintered ship impaled on the rock that had been her undoing. Except for himself, the beach was bare. No break along its smooth surface spoke of a fellow survivor from last night's disaster. Well, no help for it. Only a miracle had saved him. Too much to hope for a double miracle. He got to his feet and faced inland. Jungle, tangled and flowery, stepped down to the sand in unbroken ranks. They must have blown very far off their course, he thought. By all charts, the seas were empty here. They could scarcely, in one long night, however stormy, have blown far enough to reach land. Even such an islet as this looked to be. By all accounts, this place did not exist. That ragged reef, thrusting out of the breakers, had been a stunning shock last night, land where no land should be. He set off along the curving whiteness of the sand toward the right, walking slowly and scanning the sea's edge for signs of another castaway, hoping forlornly against hope that he was not alone. But no tracks broke the smoothness of the beach. He went a long way, sat down to rest, and fell asleep for a while, a dizzy sleep that was half a swoon. On awakening, he went on again with falling hopes. After a long time, he thought he saw footprints ahead and broke into a shambling run, shouting. But when he stood over them, he knew they were his own tracks. He had completely circled the place, and he knew now that he alone had lived through the night. He stood there in his own scattered footprints and stared out to sea, trying to orient himself. Where was he? What chances for a rescue? No use. Every attempt to locate the islet in his mind was frustrated by the very fact of its existence here, in a place which by rights should not exist. An islet. And there had been no land of any sort within days of their last position before the storm struck. He shrugged his shoulders ruefully and gave it up. Hunger was beginning to gnaw at him, and his throat was dry. That meant an exploration of the jungle in search of food and water, and, he glanced down with a wry grin, he was ill-equipped for hunting. Even his knife was gone. Barefoot, clad only in the tatters of self-stiffened shirt and breeches, a little dizzy with shock and hunger and the bone-deep ache from battling last night's breakers, he had little hope of bagging anything better than a fallen fruit or two. He shrugged again and turned toward the jungle. There was little undergrowth, and the great vine-wreathed trees stood far enough apart for him to pass easily underneath. It was quiet, very quiet. He did not realize until he had gone beyond the sound of the waves how still a place could be. It was like wading deeper and deeper into a pool of stillness. He walked softer instinctively. He was alert for animal sounds in the undergrowth, and more than once in those first few minutes he thought he heard the small scuffings and rustlings that some rodent makes when footsteps startle it, but try as he would, he could see nothing. There were bird notes overhead, too, and the stealthy sound of wings, but he could never look up quickly enough to surprise the authors of these noises. He went on deeper and deeper into the stillness, and the small denizens of the forest ran before him with the tiny, baffling sounds of flight. Hunger was tightening its grip upon him now, and sometimes the green jungle dipped sidewise before his blurring eyes, and the ground heaved underfoot. Still he saw no living thing, though the sounds of small beasts passing through the bushes tantalized him time after time, and the birds were like winged jeers, hovering invisibly to mock him with the noise of their presence. Panic began to stir within him. He felt weakness rising like a slow tide, and knew that if he surrendered now he would never go on again. After a while, he stumbled over a trailing creeper and lay still on the moss, making no effort to rise. It was cool and pleasant there in the flowery dimness. When he was quiet, the hunger did not gnaw so fiercely. He thought at times that he must be floating free of his body. He no longer felt the earth under him and knew himself to be swinging upon currents that swayed as gently as the currents of the sea. The silence closed round him like water, muffling his very brain. He sank into it, fathom by slow fathom, until he had the curious idea that he was drifting deeper and deeper toward some sea bottom of infinite depth through layers of green silence. Then it was as if some deep-running tide had stirred the green depths so that a long shudder ran through them pulsingly. He lay there in a half-coma of weariness and hunger, sinking slowly through the leagues of stillness toward. His drowning brain groped vaguely toward the knowledge of what awaited him below, with dim, wavering efforts that were nearing knowledge. Almost he grasped at the edges of understanding but the gnawing of hunger would not let him rest. He opened reluctant eyes upon a green and flowery dimness, somehow feeling as he did so that a presence which had been very near was withdrawing as he came back to the surface of reality again. A forest-haunting presence was guiding his dimming mind into channels beyond all understanding. A little breeze had risen. The vines shook together, and tremor after shuddering tremor ran ripplingly through the leaves. With the breeze, a whisper ran through the place, a whispered secret that bent the treetops down and shivered the vines with secret mirth and rustled in his ears with a maddening incoherence that verged almost on the brink of speech. He sat up and blinked a little. The leaves had suddenly taken on a new aspect, fallen into fresh patterns. There was something vaguely human in the lines that shivered through them when the wind blew. Or no, not human, but... Then for one swift instant he saw it. A mighty face, neither human nor animal. A vast, serene face whose features were unnameable, outlined in the angles of the leaves, indistinguishably. Clearly a presence hung there, trembling for the space of a heartbeat before the wind broke up its pattern and shook the branches apart. And then every leaf was a tiny, jeering mouth that whispered. Suddenly the jungle was alive, animate, inimical, with an alien, imponderable life. A reeling terror came over him. He stumbled to his feet and set off at a staggering run, plunging through the underbrush, ripping at the vines that whipped his face, sick with panic. He felt the nameless presence all about him, though he saw the vast, unhuman face in every cluster of leaves whose branches limned a pattern. The trees bent down to crush him. The leaf mouths jeered and murmured. Alien and alone, the only living creature in this jungle of haunted and whispering stillness, he plunged on. When sanity returned, he was staggering heavily, blindly, through vines looping down like garlands from the branches of a mighty grove. The poignant twilight sweetness of their blossoms was heady in his nostrils. He had no recollection of how he had come here, save a vague nightmare of frenzied running. But the terror was gone now, and peace had descended upon him as gently as the evening was falling upon the jungle. He lifted his eyes and gazed ahead through the tangle of vines. Ahead of him loomed something dark and vast. He had no clearer impression of it than that a great wall of blindness beyond the trees. He stared with blurring eyes which strove to resolve that baffling darkness into some simpler terms which his brain could understand. The waves of his weakness washed up over him and receded again as an incoming tide creeps up about a rock, each wave a little higher than the last. He set his teeth and stumbled forward toward the wall. Afterward, he had no recollection of having crossed the intervening ground between himself and the darkness looming up. He advanced without conscious motion, eyes fixed in all but hypnotized stare upon that strange and nameless thing beyond the trees. He passed under the last festooning vines, and the great wall towered up before him. He thought he caught a glimpse of mighty masonry blocks. It might have been a man-made wall, save for the undefinable blurring of it, so that even as near as this his eyes refused to focus directly upon those great blocks and cubes. Then, with a gentle and inexorable force, he was drawn against the wall as a moth is flattened against a window-pane, and it was neither warm nor cool, but he felt an immense activity through all the particles of the great half-seen thing. An activity which somehow imparted itself to him and raced through him. There was a moment of the queerest blurring, as if fusion were taking place, as if the wall drank him in. Those atoms of nameless substance were penetrating his own being. He felt a mighty drawing power fusing them into one. For a timeless instant he was diffused and multiple, and the masonry blocks spread through the atoms that composed him, and his own flesh was a part of the wall. It was an osmosis of solids. He had no clear impression of what was happening, for the substance of his mind was as diffused and intermingled as that of his body. There were wide, blank spaces in his memory afterward, as if the stony material of the wall were one with his brain. 2. He was standing in darkness inside the wall. He waited, motionless, trying to coordinate his curiously unmanageable impressions, trying to organize himself into an individual being again, and gradually the darkness lightened about him as his eyes adjusted themselves. He seemed to be standing in an arched hallway through whose walls a very faint crimson light filtered translucently. After a while, in the utter stillness of the place, he began to sense a deeply throbbing beat, pulsing through the hall in waves that grew heavier and heavier as his senses adjusted themselves to the perception of it, until the whole dim hallway was alive and aching with its might. Presently, with swimming head, he stepped out into the center of the passage. At the first step, he staggered, regained his balance with an effort. He became aware that this hall had never been built for human feet to travel. It was a great tube, the floor curving up to meet the curving walls. He struck out along the upward slope of it after a moment of indecision. Those great beating throbs seemed indefinably to emanate from above. His dizziness was too strong for him to be greatly astonished or alarmed as he plodded up the tubular passage in a shimmering daze, accepting his surroundings with no more than a passing acknowledgement. Food, rest, he could think in no other terms. He stumbled on heavily up the hall. All about him, as he made his slow way through the dimness, he felt a tremendous activity of the material that made up the passage. The very air seemed to hum with action and purpose towards some mysterious end too far removed from his understanding to be grasped. And ever that beating pulse strengthened and grew until he was lost in great intangible surges of power streaming by him and away. He went on a long way up the steady slope through the humming, unseen activity, breasting the current that flowed so heavily past, realizing his surroundings with only a small part of his dimmed brain. After many minutes, during every step of which the pulse beat heavier until his head was ringing with the cosmic thunder of it, the steady flow of that power broke without warning into a maelstrom of wild activity. It snatched him into its vortex with a stunning suddenness, whirled him up and over and tempestuously, all out of balance and control. The walls spun about him, and the forces he could not see buffeted him with whirlpool violence until all sense of direction left him, and the world was a mad upheaval of crimson darkness. As abruptly as it had begun, the tumult ended. He was flung suddenly clear of the dizzy storm center into a dark place whose vastness was one mighty ache of throbbing. It must have been the very heart of that tremendous pulse, for the power of it was so unbearable that his brain failed him and his senses reeled into an agonized oblivion before that intolerable might. Great beats of force throbbing through him slowly from head to foot brought him back, by degrees, into consciousness. He no longer felt dazed and bruised by the power of those unseen throbs. He no longer fought them. They were not beating against him now, but through him in mighty, unresisted pulses that thundered like heartbeats, permeating every atom of his being. He was one with the power that went surging through the dark. He opened his eyes, blinked, and drew a deep, quivering breath, half in amazement, half in wonder. Strength flowed through him headily. His mind was crystal clear, and he was no longer conscious of hunger, thirst, or weariness. In the new clarity of his mind, he knew intuitively that these mighty pulses beating through him were nourishment and rest and healing for every ailment that had beset him. With relief from his bodily ills, for the first time, the realization of his predicament came over him. He stared up into the darkness with awakening amazement. Where? What? Why? A tumult of questions tumbled through his brain. Dimly, he could see through the crimson night of the place that he lay in a vast chamber of the strangest shape. 2 walls of it met at right angles. The other 2 curved and merged together into further darknesses. The floor was curved, too, and the ceiling. The red twilight shivered with pulsing force, so that the walls seemed to contract and expand. He felt his own body contracting and expanding in rhythm with that mighty beat. The world had narrowed to a red darkness through which throbbed the pulsing of unseen thunders, and everything in the crimson dimness beat in tune. Under his hands, the floor was hard and smooth with a texture he did not recognize, neither warm nor cold. He felt in its surface a faint hurrying and stirring, as if the atoms of it were moving with perceptible violence upon nameless errands. He looked up. Far overhead, he sensed rather than saw the vast crimson roof curving down toward the curving walls. He listened, and the silence was heavy in his ears, though the force beats still pounded through him with an intensity that was greater than sound. And then it came to him what this great hall had been built to represent: a heart. That tube corridor along which he had come was shaped into an artery. This chamber was a ventricle of a mighty heart. Even that tumult which had flung him headlong into the place was the valve action controlling the inflow. He knit his brows and pressed both hands to the floor. No, it was not a thing of flesh. After all, he had seen the masonry blocks that built the outer wall, and this, too, must be the work of hands. But it was more than an inanimate building. A force had entered it and quickened it with a mighty life, flowing through the veins and arteries, pounding out from this huge heart in force beats instead of blood. What hands had built the place on this uncharted island? What strange, unnameable life quickened it into a simulation of flesh? And if it had a heart and a vascular system, must there not also be a brain? The thought staggered him. Was it a building? Some age-old temple to a forgotten god, infused still by the great presence of divinity? Then what animal form did it represent? Man? The artery, valve, heart ventricle were of exquisite accuracy so far as his limited knowledge went. Did that accuracy extend to the osmosis process of the wall? Could there once have dwelt here beings who combined the vascular system of mammals with the osmosis system of plants? Or had that curious absorptive power been bestowed upon the walls so that none might gain entrance save those whom the dweller within desired to receive? If he could only get outside this building, temple, whatever it might be, and see the outer shape into which it had been wrought. But he remembered the blurring of the walls under his gaze. Had that been the result of his weakness, or some inner, unseeable quality of the walls themselves, some quality that hovered on the edge of invisibility, or the brink of another dimension? He remembered that mighty face which had manifested itself briefly to him in the jungle, the brooding presence he had felt as he lay half-swooning in the green silences. He felt quite sure now that he was hovering upon the brink of some discovery so vast that his brain could scarcely compass it. Then his wonderings and his questions and almost his entire consciousness flashed away into nothing as something whirled him with dizzying suddenness into a maelstrom of violence. It swept him irresistibly along paths of whirlpool madness, out of the ventricle, through the wild activity of the valve, out along the artery, on and on, dizzily through the red twilight, down a tube corridor. He was acutely one with this living temple of a violently living god. The force that was its blood swept through him, unresisted. He whirled on its current through the great artery and out of it into smaller passages, into yet smaller ones, into great echoing cavities and down corridors once more. Vaguely, through his reeling brain went the realization that this temple had not been built in the simulacrum of a human body. Inaccurate as his knowledge was of man's inner organs, he recognized differences in the long, dim way he went. There were cavities and darknesses which had no correspondence to human anatomy. After a long while of buffeting and daze and dark, whirling on long beats of that mighty pulse which flowed so thunderously through the dimness, the force that bore him along the unquiet ways flashed him into a place of sudden light and sound, deposited him, not ungently, upon the floor of a great chamber, and died away in diffuse murmurs and sighs. He blinked painfully and sat up. The room he was staring about had no similarity to anything he could recognize as an animal organ. It was arched and lofty, irregular in shape, and the floor curved gently up to the pink-veined walls, as all the floors here curved. Vividly he realized anew that this place had never been designed for human feet to travel. By human hands it might have been made, but for no tangible human occupant. The thing that dwelt in this throbbing dark, animating these corridors and cavities and this great lighted chamber, was no palpable creature. The temple had been built for its invisible presence to permeate from wall to wall, and for no other creature to invade. If he was here now, it was by the summoning of that dweller. He felt sure of that. His heart beat a little heavily at the thought. All about him, through the throbbing air, went tiny murmurs and breathings and vagrant scents and sounds which had no meaning to him. The light which made visible the whole rose-veined place filtered through a window-like opening high up in one wall, paned with one vast translucent lens through which vague colors moved milkily. The light itself was diffused and clouded with nameless colors, illuminating the room with a misty, moving uncertainty. He saw rows of great circular openings high on the walls around the window, ranged in a symmetry he could not quite grasp. There were other openings, too, so alien in form and purpose that he could do little more than realize their presence. They conveyed no meaning at all to his groping mind. From these apertures the sounds he had heard came softly, sweet, and meaningless. Other openings, high along the walls, emitted namelessnesses that were neither sight nor scent nor sound. Through one orifice pale streamers like smoke wavered continually, and the odor of them was exquisite. They made a dim, soft sound of unearthly sweetness, and through him, as he watched and listened, went wavers of inexplicable happiness and well-being. He sensed that there were other manifestations than sight and sound and odor coming from them too, caressing and soft. He had no faculty for perceiving them, but he sensed their presence. If, as he realized after a while, this window corresponded remotely to an eye, and the openings from which sound came were the inner orifices of ears, then this being in whose image the temple was built must have had many more faculties than man, more senses than humanity's 5. A fragment of verse went through his memory. A being who hears me tapping the 5-sensed cane of mind amid such greater glories, that I am worse than blind. Some being such as this, perhaps, whose organs of perception opened upon greater glories than man ever dreamed of. 3. Drowsily he lay there, drinking in the diffused light and the sounds and perfumes of the place, feeling remotely the vast throbs of the mighty heart far away in the body of the god. And presently he began to be aware of something more than sensation, perceived or only suspected, something like a presence in the great chamber, something alive and aware and serene, and yet, no, not entirely serene, a troubled presence. He lay still, feeling that uneasiness fill the room, a questing, an incomprehension. Then, suddenly in his brain, a thought formed from without, wordless and complete. There is another presence here than ourself. Yes, he said aloud. A shudder went over the room. The walls shook and blurred. The lights dimmed for an instant, and the sounds jumbled into more meaningless patterns. "Never speak aloud," thundered a command in his brain. "Never in our presence. What are you? Whence come you? Form your answers mentally. You are the living entity whose nearness became manifest to us from the outside. Explain your origin. Are you a human creature?" "Yes, I'm a man. I was shipwrecked on this island, and as he stammered over the attempt to put into words what had happened, the voiceless presence cut off his efforts in an interruption that somehow made him realize it had read what he would have said in the instant he groped for expression. "Yes," it mused. "Yes, we had almost forgotten that such units as you exist. It has been many long ages since we were disturbed. But where am I? What?" As before, the answer outran the query, so that even before the words had left his thought centers, there came a flash through his brain that cut them off in a queer effect of memory. The reply did not come in words that formed in his mind, nor even in a flow of pure knowledge. It was as if he were recalling something long forgotten. Pictures went dancing through his mind, vivid as sudden remembrance. He saw business and confusion. He saw a people not unlike his own race, absorbed as one man in a race-wide task, which gripped the whole purpose and being of every individual in it. They were building something whose purpose he did not at once grasp. He watched them at work while time went flickering by in shutter flashes of light and dark. Deaths and births fluctuated the numbers of those who had labored, while drought, flood, famine, and eras of plenty passed almost unnoticed over the heads of this people which had dedicated its race life to the completion of something whose significance was lost upon him. He remembered not as one to whom these things had once happened, but as one who watches the memories of another play across the screen of consciousness. Much was obscure to him, and the only things which had meaning were those which paralleled his own experience. In this fashion he watched take shape under the hands of many generations a building that rose by infinitesimal degrees over centuries of time. Gradually he realized that it was the building in which he now was, this living temple. With such painstaking exactitude they built it that generations might go to the angling of a wall or the curve of an artery corridor. They built it in a likeness he could not understand, in the image of some living thing he never quite grasped. It was made without any opening to outside other than those hungry walls, and when it was finished it stood shimmery and unfocusable in the edges of his borrowed remembrance. Even then he could not make out its shape or understand in what likeness it had been formed. And it was empty, a body into which no breath of life had been infused. Now, out of that memory came beating waves of intensity that deepened and grew in successive tides until the force of it was so powerful that its very strength bore in upon his brain the knowledge of what was happening. This race which had built the temple was turning its collective mind in unbearable intensity upon the kindling of life within. Every mind in the whole great race had concentrated upon that one vast purpose of the people, excluding every other thought, shutting out all physical things, closed from time and space and matter, focusing all its power through one single thought of intense purpose upon that awakening of life within the temple. And so the Dweller was born. Out of the fusion of uncountable minds, out of the sheer intensity of purpose that gripped a race in its relentless concentration, the single mind was born. And it was like no individual mind such as he knew, but an indescribable composite which had a paradoxical individuality, yet knew no singleness. It was we thinking as I. He could get no clearer conception of it than that. The memory pictures ceased. Out of the blankness their passing left in his mind a query formed. Do you understand? He realized in it a vast impersonal aloofness which far transcended anything like contempt. It was the voice of composite billions addressing an infinitesimal unit. He felt no resentment. He was stunned by magnitude. Timidly he answered, I understand. But why? To what end was all this done? When? By whom? Too long ago for you to understand, and by a people so long forgotten their names would mean nothing to you. But the purpose was to create. There has never been a perfect world. We propose to make one in which all conditions are designed and centered upon human happiness. No world in the cosmos is suited to that end, and no existent race is capable of dwelling happily under conditions of perfection. But our race desired happiness so strongly that it undertook the task of creating such a world and such a people. We assumed this form of self for that end. It is so vast an undertaking that we still grope for the foundations upon which to build. Even we sometimes come near to bafflement, but we shall succeed. In the end, we shall succeed. Look! Abruptly, a force greater than anything he had encountered before gripped the man. He was flashed aloft with an instantaneity which outran time itself, so that he found himself grasping before the great milky-paned window without any recollection of having risen. The vast lens of the eye rose up before him, its opacity somehow not impeding his vision, for he could see what lay outside more clearly than he had ever seen anything before. Through the translucency of the eye he gazed out upon gray nothing, a flat plain of blank. Across it passed vague darknesses which took shapes and faded again like the reflections of things to come, the shadows of thoughts moving through the mind of the presence. And something like awe came over him as he realized clearly, for the first time, the measureless capacity for inclusion which dwelt in this composite mind. With a part of its consciousness, it spoke in his brain, conjuring up memories out of its race remembrance. Yet there was an infinitely vaster part that groped through voids in search of perfection, casting shadows upon this grayness he watched. Beyond these, did he not sense a mighty third, brooding serenely and alone over serene eternal thoughts? There was a cosmic dizziness in the speculation that made his senses reel. He turned back to the blankness outside, and as he watched, it began to take on depth and motion, stirring restlessly within itself. Presently he became aware that something was in the making. The misty stuff rolled up to one side, higher and higher, thickening into a nebulous dark that by degrees became a mist-wreathed mountain, a range of mountains, a long, ragged vista of veiled peaks rising against a background of nothingness. High up among its clouds, something flashed white. Towers, walls, an unreal city taking shape. Slowly it rose, its outlines shifting and forming again until it stood high and shining, a crown upon the mountain peaks. Clouds rolled over it. Light darted blindingly 2 or 3 times through the obscurity. When the mist had cleared away, the city lay in white ruins all down the purple slopes. The mountains blurred together, paled, thinned. Fog billowed in great soft surges to blot them out again, and gray blankness closed once more over the vanished creation. Still the mist surged restlessly, churned by the roving mind of the presence into nebulous shapes that faded half-formed. He saw rocky coasts over which broke waves of curling mist. He saw broad plains that arched themselves up and rolled into mountains and melted again to nothingness. Great, blurred shapes blundered through the fog, monsters out of evolution's remotest dawning, and once or twice man-forms flashed briefly through the dimness. Great cities took shape and faded again. Rivers rushed soundlessly down fog-wreathed gorges to a misty sea, but the gray swallowed everything up and moved uneasily in the birth of other things. Nor were all the fragmentary creations purely material things. He caught the queerest dim tides of emotion surging through the fog, somehow perceptible to an inner vision which the presence had awakened in him. That vast mind drew waves of violence and of peace through the plasm of worlds in which it experimented, combining emotions in strange patterns to produce reactions upon the mind of the watcher which he could put no name to and had never dreamed could exist. He realized that the presence was building up complex structures out of these patterns, just as it had built mountains and cities, and like them, discarded everything in the restless search for that yet hidden goal. A sudden flash of color in the ever-changing dimness caught him abruptly out of his groping effort to follow the workings of the compound mind about him. In one bewildered glimpse, he saw a girl form glowing through the mist. He caught his breath on a gasp and bent forward eagerly. Her vividness was as stunning as a blow, sharp and vital and alive in the midst of all this shifting nothingness. In the instance of her appearance, he thought he sensed a sudden tensing in the vast, composite presence that enfolded him, something like an awakened interest, surprised and attentive, centering upon himself. It was no more than a fleeting impression, for his whole mind was intent upon the bright figure of that girl. There was something about her that pulled curiously at his emotions. Even in the flashing glimpse which was all he had of her, he knew in that instant only that she was lovely and slim and light-footed and queerly familiar. But almost as his eyes found her, she faded as smoke fades in a breeze, blurred and melted until she was nothing but a brightly colored smudge of drifting vapor around which the dimness closed again. Violence flared suddenly within him as the gay mist vanished, poignant loss and an ache of longing, a swift urge to follow, somehow, a sharp necessity to look more nearly into the vivid face he had scarcely seen. The desire was a quick flame within him. Its urgency must have touched the great presence, so queerly intent upon what was happening, for a voice said in his brain, "Go, then." And suddenly, everything blurred. He realized nothing but that. Again, the presence moved along those ways which lie outside time, so that without intervening motion he was, in a breathless instant, swallowed up in the mist he had been watching from afar. In place of the great chamber's walls, billowing fog rolled up all around him. His feet pressed some unseen sponginess, and the queer, empty odor of mist was in his nostrils. Not until long after did it occur to him to wonder if it had been in his material form that he stumbled through the fog. Whether or not sensations were perceptible to him as they were to his own body, and he was aware in a remote, disinterested way of other sensations, too, nameless and new, he did not heed them. He was blinded and lost and a little dazed with the suddenness of transition, but the bright memory of the girl still blazed behind his eyes. He stumbled forward through the grayness in the forlorn hope that he might yet find her. The ground gave disconcertingly underfoot. He floundered like a man in deep snow as he groped through the dimness. And then suddenly he caught a whiff of fragrance and saw upon the surging mist ahead a faint stain of color. He plunged forward, holding his breath in the wild hope that he might be about to come upon that vanished loveliness again. The colors deepened and ran in shifting patterns over the fog wreaths all about him until he stood embowered in rainbows, and then they began to draw together. Breathless, he watched. The colors cleared and concentrated. The swimming patterns paled. Slowly, out of the rose-smudged fog, the girl took shape again. The slim curves of her grew clearer and clearer through the veiling mist. She put on reality by degrees until she was standing vivid and gay and enchanting before his eager eyes. 4. She was not a stranger. There was no feature of her he had not known before. For one flashing instant, he stared into the blue, bewitching eyes, the familiar face, before she whirled in a cloud of pale hair and vanished in the engulfing mist that closed like water about the whiteness of her. "Wait!" he called. "Come back! Come back!" But the words rolled back in dim echoes from the muffling fog, and the girl was gone. He plunged after her, stretching out groping hands into emptiness, running uncertainly through the mist, stumbling over the spongy ground. Presently he caught a flash of white in the grayness ahead and called once more, "Wait! Come back!" This time she must have heard him, and to his surprise she paused and hesitated, looking back over her shoulder. Again he called. Slowly she turned and came back through the mist, her head bent and the long hair showering over her shoulders. He saw that by now its pale gold had deepened to a warmer tone, and her eyes were darkening too. She was unstable as the shifting lands about her. Walking like a white ghost through the mist, she neared him. As she came, the fog cleared from about her. A dim woodland was rising like smoke columns through the gloom. Spectre trees bent above her ruddy head. She did not seem to realize their presence. A long shudder of that queer, indescribable emotion which he had sensed as he watched from the window of the eye suddenly shivered through the fog forest. The whole scene rippled like a reflection upon water, and his own mind shook and clouded to its passing violence. But the girl came serenely forward, untouched. When she paused before him at last, her hair had darkened to sheeny blackness, and a warm glow of brown was veiling the pallor of her body. Her eyes, brightly dark behind curving lashes, stared through him with unseeing placidity. "Look at me," he commanded. The black gaze did not flicker. Serenely empty, it swam past him, intent upon nothingness. Her lovely, familiar features were untroubled by any trace of emotion, any faintest hint of a mind behind the bright, dark eyes. Impulsively he seized her by the shoulders and stooped his face to the level of hers. Under his hands her flesh was warm and firm and smooth, but there was about it an indescribable feeling of impermanence, as if at any moment that rounded body might melt back into the mist from which it sprang. "Look at me," he said again, and concentrated all his will into the determination that she must see him, that intelligence must awaken, and sight come into being behind the empty brilliance of her eyes. Placidly unseeing, she stared past him into oblivion. He set his teeth and gripped her shoulders harder, and turned all his will into an infinite resolution that she must see him. She must. His whole being centered upon that necessity until the blood pounded at his temples with the violence of his concentration, and everything dissolved about him, save the liquid blankness of the black eyes into which he stared. Very slowly, under the almost superhuman centering of his whole mind, a faint flickering awoke in the depths of those serene eyes. Seeing it, a surge of triumph went through him, and he bent more intensely than he would have believed possible the whole strength of energy and mind and will upon that awakening. It was a strain that could not be continued long. He concentrated the more fiercely because he knew that, willing her to intelligence with all the power that was in him. The stirring flicker quickened in those blank eyes. A little grimace crossed the placidity of her features. Very slowly, by infinitely painful degrees, while his mind strained its utmost and the blood pounded in his ears with the effort of concentration, he evoked awareness in that empty gaze. Conscious life swam up through their depths. Intelligence awoke. She stared in mesmerized wonder into his own compelling gaze, while the knowledge of what living meant bloomed slowly behind her eyes. The wonder grew and grew as she stared. Her mouth began to quiver. Under his gripping hands, he felt her shaking with the amazement of that infinite awakening. And then suddenly a little cry broke from her lips, and her hands flew up to hide her face. He stepped back, arms falling to his sides, weak and shaken with the relaxation of that tremendous effort. But he had succeeded. The girl stood staring at him, wide-eyed, hands pressed to her suddenly flushed cheeks, and a troubled wonder still shining upon her face. And all the old familiarity had redoubled in intensity now that life lighted that sweet brown face. It was more baffling than before, and twice as tantalizing. The concentration of her gaze upon him roused something warm and pleasant in his wearied mind. He smiled. Her mouth twitched, curled up experimentally. She was smiling back with her first conscious effort. Triumph surged hotly through him. He had created. He had wakened into being an imitative mind whose first effort was a smile. Her eyes slipped from his and wandered about the smoky vistas of that fog forest which stretched about them. It was fading as she turned to look. Mist thickened between the dim trees, veiling the aisles of melting woodland. Clouds swirled forward to blot out the forest. A faint pucker gathered between her brows. When the eyes returned to his, they were troubled. After a moment, her lips parted, and she spoke, uncertainly, hesitatingly, her first words. "There is more to the world than this," she stated with a gentle sureness. "I know that. Where is it?" He shook his head. There was no answer he could make that would have meaning to her. As he opened his mouth to speak, the mist surged forward about them in an abrupt tide. The sponginess underfoot quivered. "Don't be frightened," he said quickly. "A change is coming now. Watch." The yielding ground tilted sharply. Through the fog he heard the girl's gasp. He stumbled an uncertain step or two forward and took her, trembling and afraid, in the bend of his arm, stilling her fright against his shoulder as the ground rose at an angle so steep that he was hard put to maintain his balance. The mist swirled grayly about them. Sounds of rumbling and thunder rolled through the fog. The tilted sponginess underfoot quivered. Then, gradually, it steadied, and the mist began to clear. They stood on the height of a ragged mountain. Its peaks stretched broken summits upward into the hovering gray overhead. Below them, far away at the foot of sheer dropping cliffs, a green land of meadows and streams lay spread. Warm light brooded over it from some invisible source, and its trees stirred in the breezes. It was a sleeping land, untenanted by any animate life, but fair as a garden in paradise as it lay there in its frame of back-rolled mist. The man found himself envying a little the race which might one day people that pleasant green place, and the girl in his arms turned a troubled face downward, staring in puzzled wonder at the faraway panorama. "I can remember almost," she murmured. "I think I know that place. It is—" The words broke off as walls of mist surged forward like an incoming tide in breakers that blotted out the whole green valley from sight. The thick blindness of it swirled over them, and again the ground was shifting beneath their feet, and the girl hid a terrified face against his shoulder as another, stirring in the mist, spoke of dawning creation. This time, as the curtains of the grayness swept back, they looked down into a city, white-walled and lovely in the midst of a fair green valley. Shadows passed bewilderingly over it from no visible source, and there was the illusion of life in its streets, a faint stirring and hurrying, although no animate creature moved there. The girl leaned forward to look. He heard her catch her breath. "Oh, there!" she cried. "There! That city! I remember." Down swept the veiling mist in a rush that blotted out the white walls and Green Valley so swiftly that the words died on her lips. She turned a troubled face up, searched the man's eyes with a questing stare. "What is it I remember?" she asked. "It's gone now, but for a moment I knew." She paused, for she must have seen that he was not listening. He was watching her lovely, sun-golden face in a wonder and puzzlement so deep that her words had little meaning to him. That face was so bewilderingly familiar that he realized suddenly he knew before it happened just how her brows would lift delicately in query, just how her mouth would quirk as she spoke. He said, "Why are you so familiar to me? Who are you?" She looked at him in silence, a deep wonder swimming in her eyes. Gradually, knowledge seemed to dawn there, an awareness of something he could not understand. She looked about in the rolling mist with little glances of searching, half panic. What she saw seemed to overwhelm her, for suddenly she twisted from his arms and buried her face in her hands, the black hair swirling forward as she sobbed. "I'm not real. I know it now. I'm nobody. I'm nothing. I shouldn't be born yet. Oh, let me go back." Helplessly, he laid his hands on her shaking shoulders. She shrugged them off violently, the wail of her voice rising behind her hands. "Don't! Don't! I'm not ready to exist. I don't want to be. Why did you make me come alive? I want to go back. I'm not real. My dear," he cried. "Please don't. You belong to me. I've known you for so long. Just how your eyes would be, and the tilt of your nose, and the way your mouth closes. I've known you always. You are real. You belong to me." Her hands dropped. With drenched eyes, she faced him. "No," she said, a little more calmly. "I belong to no one. I shouldn't exist. I'm not ready yet to be alive. I belong to all these things we've seen, the woods and the green valley and the city I remembered for a moment before it disappeared. Somewhere, sometime in the future, I have a life to live, but not now, not yet. The race I belong with hasn't begun. The world I should dwell in isn't even created yet, and here I am, lost out of time and space and my own life. I'm alive, but I shouldn't be. I'm not real. I want to go back." But, he stared at her in a wordless confusion. The very thought of her dissolution back into the grayness that had formed her made him sick with an emptiness he could not explain. She was so dearly familiar. Not until he spoke had he realized that he had indeed known her always, just that sweet brown face and bending, sunburned body. She belonged to him by every right of long knowledge and understanding. From the first glimpse he had had of her, he felt that, yielding without resistance to the curious, appealing pull of her, the ache of urgency to be near her always. The answer broke upon his consciousness with a blinding simplicity. He gulped and said, "I love you. I can't let you go." Her eyes widened upon his. A subtle terror woke in them. "No, no," she gasped. "I'm not ready for love. I can't. I daren't. I'm not ready for life, I tell you. Not real. All I want is to go back, to wait for my own time. I daren't love. She sobbed as the words left her lips and closed her eyes tight as if to shut out the very fact of his existence along with the sight of him. The man looked at her helplessly. There was no way now that he could undo what had happened. The very thought of its undoing was intolerable to him. But the distress in her voice was intolerable too, and after a moment he realized what he must do. He looked at her. She was weeping now, her face averted and the tears running out beneath her closed lids. And it seemed to him that her grief was more violent than the mere longing to return into oblivion once more. She wept as one weeps who must lose something precious, but impossible to retain. In sudden resolution he laid an arm across her shoulders, pulling her forward. "Come," he said. "We'll go back. We'll see what can be done." She sobbed aloud as he spoke, and suddenly gripped his arm with urgent fingers, though her face was still averted. Wordlessly, still weeping, still clinging to his arm in a grip whose tightness bespoke a terror of losing him, she moved forward at his side. In silence, they went down the misty mountain that gave so spongily under their stumbling feet. He had no idea in what direction he should head to return into that vast chamber of the presence. For all he knew, it might be impossible ever to return, and the girl's clinging to his arm had roused a fantastic hope which made everything else seem trivial. It was only by an immense effort that he forced his mind away from the thought of her and turned it, with all the intensity he could manage, toward the great composite mind of the dweller in the living temple, calling through the dimness for its aid. 5. The mist churned and twisted all about them as they stumbled on. The scenes faded into nothing. They walked a city's streets, great dim houses rising above them smokily. They waded a shallow sea that washed the feet of the dissolving city. 3 times long currents of nameless emotion shivered through the gloom and shook them both in tides of violence that reached the depths of their very souls and passed on again, leaving them weak. Once a great flight of steps rose under their feet. They climbed toward a mighty portal whose yawning darkness made the girl gasp in some half-remembered awe and terror. But before they could reach it, the fog had blotted out everything, and they groped again through nothingness. All about them, the shadows of the presence's thoughts floated dimly, shaping the mist into world thoughts that faded, half-formed. But these shadowy whims of creation did not touch the man's own mind. Time and again he strove to establish some contact with the brain that was manifesting its power so eloquently in the mist, but no contact came. Enveloped and lost in those vast, shifting thoughts, yet untouched by them, he went on, still striving with all his brain's intensity for contact. And then, quite suddenly, it came. His questing mind brushed a vaster one with a momentary touch, and exactly as a hand groping in dimness meets and grips another, so the great brain of the presence seized upon his. There was a pull, as if the strength of that meeting hand were lifting him. The gray mist swam and faded. With his last conscious effort, he tightened his arm about the girl. Then everything blurred again, and once more the presence swept him along paths outside time, so that he had no recollection of having moved. The great rose-veined chamber of the presence enclosed them both. With the girl still gripped in his arm, he stood upon its throbbing floor, the great walls arching over him, the far-off pulses of the mighty heart beating in measured rhythm through his innermost being. The presence was a tangible thing in the vast room. He felt it seeking through his mind, drawing out the knowledge of what had passed. Queerly grateful that he need not enter into long explanations of what was still inexplicable to him, he stood quiescent, feeling knowledge draining out of him into the consciousness of the vast, united mind. The girl had hidden her face against his shoulder, and her fingers still gripped his arm with desperate strength. Presently a thought flowed smoothly into his brain. "You tell yourself that you love this girl. That is untrue. It was your love which created her. Your presence in our brain as we meditated upon creation was strong enough to project your own thoughts upon the plasm from which we are molding worlds. When the figure of a girl flashed across our mind, yours seized upon it and shaped it into your own interpretation of perfection. Unconsciously but surely, you created your own ideal with all the features which seemed to you capable of arousing love. Inevitably, you felt that love when you gazed upon them, and because we were curious to see what would evolve, we sent you out to follow." "Yes," thought the man rebelliously, "and see what has happened? How can it be undone now? For however I came to love her, even you cannot deny that I do love her now." Silence for a while as the presence meditated. The girl was breathing in little gasps, and her fingers dug into his arms. "She belongs in her own world and time," came the voiceless thought at last. "She could have no reality outside them. Her body, half real as it is, you might keep, but you would not desire it so, for the mind which dwells in it will always belong in that other life, that yet unborn future. But as for me," broke in the man, "my mind will always be with her, wherever she is. Can't you see that? It is the same with me, for though my body exists in my own life and time, yet my very existence will always center on her. I can't leave her." The girl in his arms wriggled in sudden alarm. Across his mind surface floated a plaintive wail from her inarticulate brain. "I want to go back," it cried bewilderingly. "But do not leave me. I could not bear to have you leave me." Another silence. Out of it, the voiceless presence spoke serenely. "Yes, yes, man, you have spoken more truly than you realize. In one sense, your mind will always be with this woman because, by the strength of it, you awakened her out of her plasm state of unaware and impermanent existence into conscious life and semi-reality. By that act, you infused enough of your personality into her to make you two indissolubly one. Henceforth, each of you is incomplete without the other. We have permitted the ingredients of this curious union to exist, and we have no choice now but to accept it, for love is too powerful a force for even ourself to tamper with. We cannot force you apart." "But neither can we exist together," said the man despairingly. "What shall we do?" His arms tightened about the girl, and she began to sob again in small, hopeless gasps. "Peace, peace," the great voice throbbed wordlessly through the chamber. "There is no question about an answer. The acceptance of yours you must decide in your own mind, but the answer itself is clear. The woman is a part of our presence, the product of our united brain. She must return into the unit that is we. But with her she carries a vital part of your humanity. You have the choice of merging with her and with ourself, abandoning your body and the physical life which animates it to join with that single immortal spark which is essentially yourself in the composite unit of our presence. Only thus can you two know union. Dubiously, the man hesitated as the voice fell still in his brain. He felt no affinity with the presence, certainly no urge to abandon his animate life in order to join some intangible nucleus of ultimate self in its mighty purpose. And how could he let the girl in his arms leave them? How could he? Sharply, across his hesitance, the voice of the presence broke. There is no choice, it said with calm finality. The girl must go back. Suddenly he was aware of a curious lessening in the firmness of the warm body he held against his breast. Instinctively his arms tightened and sank unresisted into semi-solidity. In terror he looked down. The girl was fading. Mistily outlined, uncertain as a vision, she was melting into the colored fog from which she had sprung. Despairingly he clutched after the vanishing shape his own dreams had evoked, and saw only his hands passing unresisted through nothingness. Like the dream she was, she faded in his very arms until all reality was gone from her, and nothing remained but a blur of brightly colored fog that dissipated upon the clear, throbbing air within the chamber. Inarticulate rebellion choked up in his throat. Anger was bubbling hotly in the protest that rose to the surface of his consciousness. But before it had reached the levels of articulation, before he could frame his thoughts for the mental utterance which passed here for speech, something very strange and wonderful happened. He could not have described it, but quite suddenly the deepest sensation of intimacy came warmly over him, and he paused in the midst of his wrath and protest to gasp in the sudden wonder of it. With that gasp, all rebellion died, all need for rebellion. In that breathless moment, so close, a sense of unity with all that surrounded him was dawning that his very brain went mute with the splendor of it. It was a more exquisitely warm and intimate sensation than any human could ever have experienced before. He was no longer a unit, alone and in discord, struggling against forces stronger than his greatest effort. All about him closed an enfolding presence that was one with his innermost being. No words can describe the peace of it, the blessed surcease from all that had tormented him. In the very center of his own innermost consciousness, a serene voice radiated. This is what surrender means, O foolish human, it said. The girl you love has merged again into the unit which is ourself, carrying with her that portion of your vitality called love. A part of you is one with ourself now, and by its merging, you gain a kinship with our presence. Do not resist, do not struggle. This is greater than individuality. This is true happiness, the submerging of self in the unity of the whole. Be one with us. That last inarticulate command diffused itself through the man's consciousness in waves that spread like ripples in a pool, fading imperceptibly into the vast, serene rhythm of the presence. He scarcely heeded the voice's cessation. He was no longer thinking as a unit. In the completest relaxation, spreading beyond the body and the mind and into the innermost places of the very soul, he was surrendering himself to the all-pervading serenity of the presence. Nothing troubled him now. The answers to all his questions and doubts and hesitancies were absorbed, unasked, in the great calm of that composite brain which was receiving him. In the depths of his serenity, with an untroubled perception which accepted without wonder, he began to be aware of sensations he had never known before. Ripples of light, surges of colors without name, washes of sound, wave upon wave of wonder. He began to perceive kaleidoscopic patterns forming as wave crossed wave and rollers of sensation broke across surges of nameless raptures, patterns that blended indescribably into one mighty design which extended far beyond the confines of 3 dimensions, reaching out to infinity through space and time and the borders of the ultimate dimension. He was becoming less conscious of that pattern. Its colors and sensations were somehow becoming his own, and he was a vast and patterned thing which stretched across dimensions and filled space from edge to edge. Space, which has no borders, and now consciousness itself was melting away. A burst of roaring glory blotted out all sensation. Something brushing across his forehead called him back to consciousness. He opened blank eyes upon a green forest world. A vine, trailing over a great broken stone beside him, had touched his face with its leaves as the wind blew. He sat up and stared dully around. He was seated at the edge of a vast gray ruin whose broken blocks heaped the ground as far as his eyes could penetrate the jungle. It was an old ruin, for vines had grown up over it and moss was thick upon the gray stones. There was something unpleasant about the luxuriousness of that moss, the green, voluptuous vines. A faint odor, like that of long decayed flesh, hung over the broken blocks, and the green things thrust avid roots into their cracks and crevices, flourishing out of the grayness as out of the richest soil. The man's eyes slid unheedingly over the ruin. Something was teasing at the back of his brain, and he knit his brows in a stupid effort at remembrance. He seemed, somehow, with a remote part of himself, to be swimming in seas of glory, breasting surf whose crests broke into music, floating lightly as a dream through depths of nameless beauty. He could recall colors and the loveliest waves of sound in a peace so deep it drowned his very brain in quiet. And then the memory faded. He felt heavy and very dull, and a little frightened. That other self was drawing farther and farther away, melting into the splendor, losing all contact with the body that had housed it. Somehow he wanted to cry, and slow tears presently began to trickle down his face. But he had forgotten why. After a while, a light caught his eyes, and he turned an empty gaze toward the west, where the glow of sunset shone through the trees. He smiled happily and stumbled to his feet, setting off at a shambling walk toward it. He blundered into trees as he went, tore through vines that hung down across his path. Branches whipped his face, but he made no move to fend them off. His hands swung, forgotten, at his sides. He came out upon the beach in time to see the last of the red glow sinking beyond the horizon. He would have walked straight on toward it, but the water lapping about his ankles distracted him, and he sank down in the edge of the surf, playing contentedly with some shells that had washed up on the shore. The light went slowly out of the sky behind him.